No, it's my pleasure to host Alex Konings from Stanford here. You know, it is on. Yes, I think so. Is it? Yes. Okay, good. Maybe I should speak louder. But so I didn't know Alex personally, but I was very familiar with her research. Alex is a graduate of MIT, and now he's a faculty. She's a faculty at Stanford University. Her research is mostly focused on remote sensing and understanding of vegetation water stress on a global scale. You have won a lot of awards. So basically, Alex is a rising star in hydrology. She received NSF Career Award. She received NASA Early Career Award. And I think these two speaks loudly about who she is. Floor is yours. It's a pleasure to have you here, Alex. So.
Many thanks for the introduction, Ardashir. Hopefully that mic situation is working out great. I'm going to start by apologizing. I have a lingering cough from COVID several weeks ago, so I promise I can't get you sick, and I will try to cough away from the mic, but unfortunately can't quite avoid it. I also want to start. It's very nice, Ardashir, to introduce me so friendly, but you know, this is really the work I'm presenting here, and the work that has gotten me all those fancy schmancy awards is really totally on the strength of the awesome students and postdocs that I've been lucky to work with. So I just wanted to put up their pictures here: Natan, Jackie, Anlan, Mustafa, Krishna, and Paula. A bunch of them will be at AGU, and hopefully you'll sort of recognize the names through the talk. So if there's anything you see that's interesting, I'm happy to talk while I'm here, but please also talk to them. So, you know, Ardashir sort of said, nicely, my work is really focused a lot on what I'm going to be talking about today from sort of an overview point of view, and that's how we can use microwave remote sensing to study what I'm going to call here the plant response to water stress, and we can talk more about what that means in a second. But you know, it's basically looking at sort of the hydrology and the ecology of how vegetation might respond when there's some sort of change in hydrologic conditions. And I think there's a couple different reasons to care about that thing that I just tried to clarify and still said something hand wavy about, right? And that sort of why you might care might depend a bit on your interests. I know we have some sort of, you know, hydrology, fluid mechanics-y bend here at SAFL. So if you're a hydrologist, right, you might care because that response of plants is going to have a big effect on stomatal closure and on transpiration. And the amount of transpiration in turn will affect the ET, the evapotranspiration, and sort of the surface energy balance, which, as you can see in this diagram on the top here, can go and actually affect the evolution of the boundary layer, the evolution of humidity, all the way up to precipitation, heat wave evolution, sort of land-atmosphere interactions in general. And so how plants respond to water stress are one small but key piece of that. Even if you don't care about feedbacks to the atmosphere, right, from a just basic hydrology point of view, if we look here at just a sort of catchment scale water balance, right, we see that the ET is significant here, and that changes in that response of ET, or that dynamics of ET, might just influence the partitioning of precipitation and how that actually affects you know, runoff and storage changes and the hydrologic cycle as a whole, right? So these vegetation responses here matter a lot. If you're not a hydrologist, but maybe you're more interested in ecology, right? There's also reasons to care about this. I mentioned stomatal closure affecting transpiration in the last slide. That stomatal closure is really the balance of sort of trying to, you know, for the plant, trying to find the right balance of not losing too much water, but also taking up sufficient carbon for photosynthesis. So this time series on the right here, for example, is there's two different species with different stomatal closure properties due to different responses to plant water stress, as I like to call it. And you see, even if these are plants growing alongside same hydrometeorological conditions, you know, the ultimate photosynthesis rate can be quite different. And regardless of photosynthesis, this is also going to have a big effect on sort of more extreme things like drought-driven tree mortality or wildfire. So, just in general, I think this is an interesting research topic. But unfortunately, there's a couple key challenges that come in here. One is that when we're interested in these processes, we have the same challenges as many other things, which is that if we pick any sort of global map of in situ sensors of relevant measurements, it will look something like this map from FluxNet, where almost all of the measurements are in the mid-latitudes, even when some of the most exciting signals perhaps are in the tropics. And then secondly, as I already was alluding to a couple slides ago, with plant water stress, we have this additional sort of particularly high spatial variability issue, right? So I showed a photosynthesis plot of two species growing alongside each other before. Here's an example of mortality. These are pinyon pines and junipers, again, growing alongside each other. And I guess the light here doesn't quite work out with this picture, or rather the picture doesn't work with the light, but hopefully you can sort of see, a ton of green alongside some pretty dead trees, right? Again, same conditions, different responses of the plants, even right next to each other, totally different behavior. And this is an example with two species as extreme as mortality, but fill in your sort of quantitative level of discretization that you want, right? I'm not really going to go into this figure on the right here. This is a drought response trait whose exact properties don't matter. But the point here is this is one site in South Africa, right? Bunch of different species growing alongside each other and really spanning almost a full sort of range of variability of this particular axis in how they respond. So we have a ton of diversity and at the same time a real bias in where our measurements are. And so in my biased view, I think this therefore makes this problem be one that remote sensing is particularly helpful for, right? Because when we have spaceborne remote sensing, we kind of naturally get global scale measurements. And you get sort of a natural aggregation over all of that variability. So hence the remote sensing in the title of my talk. I'm going to, as Ardeshir alluded to, I'm going to be talking especially about remote sensing techniques for estimating something called vegetation water content, which is not an increasingly common variable, but not a super common one. So I also wanted to just briefly introduce, kind of set the stage for that one. And when we say vegetation water content, what we mean is just actually how much water is actually held within the above ground component of the plants. So, kilograms per meter squared, mass of water per area. And we can think about that sort of from any balance equations type point of view, right? From the plant point of view, if we think of the whole above ground component, there's some transpiration or ET of water flux leaving the plant, some sort of uptake from the roots below, going into the above ground component of the plant, and that's going to be driving these vegetation water content dynamics. Now I mentioned all of this because classical hydrology basically ignores this, right? It says, okay, well, if I write my typical equations for ET, maybe I'll just say that as a function of soil moisture and assume that the sort of flow of water from the soil to the plant is instantaneous. But as Shui and others here know well, right, that's not in fact the case. And there's sort of increasing evidence that this makes a big influence, has big influence on the fluxes. And what's relevant is that the water content changes, excuse me, also are associated with changes in the water potential inside the plant, which actually drive that whole sort of upward motion through the entire sort of soil plant atmosphere continuum. So this water content, again, not a common variable, but it's one that I'll talk about we can get with remote sensing, and it actually is key to the fluxes of water through the plant. So that's a bit of motivation. Maybe we'll back out a bit now and talk a little bit about where I'm going with all of this, right? So what I'm going to do in this talk is I want to talk a little bit more about microwave remote sensing just to set the stage, and talk about why I think microwave remote sensing gives us this capability that I just mentioned. And then I just want to kind of give you an overview of three different applications for this data to give you an example of what I mean when I say, okay, we can use this to study plant water stress response. Let me get some water to stop this cough. All right. So, I said microwave remote sensing is useful for vegetation water content. I won't go into too much electromagnetics here, but I wanted to just kind of briefly talk about why we say that and why microwaves might be particularly useful here, since across remote sensing, they're not the most common data type. And the basic reason is just this sort of line at the top here, right? Microwave electromagnetic frequencies is a sort of range where you're relatively sensitive to the water content of whatever you're looking at, whether that be, vegetation or something else. And then the other key advantage I think that microwave remote sensing has over other types of remote sensing, most other types of remote sensing, is that microwave observations, unlike everything else, is relatively insensitive to the occurrence of clouds. You can, basically sense through the clouds. And if you're interested in something like hydrologic changes, right, things are moving fast and often, you might think that having frequent measurements is quite important, right? And I think I like this figure. It's getting horribly out of date, kind of creeping up on that scary 10-year line here. But this figure I think illustrates this really well, right? Because this is July 2013 was actually a period when there were historic sort of heat waves and droughts across much of the northern hemisphere. And even in this month, right, this what's plotted here, as you can see, is the cloud fraction is just a fraction of that month when clouds are present and would have obscured non-microwave remote sensing. And so you can see that even in this month where we might particularly want this information, right, about what's happening with water at the soil and in plants, there's a ton of whites where sort of most remote sensing might not have been helpful, right? So this is a key thing that gets me excited about microwaves. On the slightly less excited side, I just wanted to sort of give a brief shout out and explanation here. So microwave remote sensing has traditionally been used for soil moisture because I told you it's sensitive to the water content, right? That includes everything that you're looking at. And thus, if you're looking at a piece of land, it includes both the water in the soil and in the vegetation. So there's this dependence on both. And there's a whole bunch of algorithmic stuff that I'm happy to talk about, or you can talk to Ardashir about, that I'm not going to go into, and that's not trivial, but that allows us to basically use different polarizations to sort of separate out this vegetation component. And then the very last bit of housekeeping thing I'm just going to do is just mention very quickly, because again, I know we have sort of a range of microwave jockeys and not in this room, is that there's sort of two relevant types of microwave remote sensing, right? On the one hand, we can use a passive radiometer. So we're basically just looking at natural gray body emission from the earth and everything around us and using that to interpret the water sensor. That's most of what this talk will be about, because radiometers are nice from the point of view of extracting from the raw measurements that signal of how much vegetation water content we have. The downside is that they're relatively low resolution data, tens of kilometers, depending on the exact data set. I wanted to very quickly mention that you can also do some of this, even though it's a little bit more difficult from a retrieval point of view. You can also get some of this information with radar, where we're actively sending in the same frequency range electromagnetic waves from an instrument, looking at how much is scattered back. And I mention that only because the resolution of radar is a lot higher. So you'll see a couple high resolution maps in here as well. Don't get confused. That's maybe the only part of the slide you really have to remember if you want to. But what's nice is the radiometers, especially in all of these, both of these can really tell us about this quantity that I'm going to be mentioning a lot, known as the VOD, the vegetation optical depth is what we're actually sensing. And the nice part is that there's been a lot of sort of theoretical and field campaign work to show that we can basically treat VOD as linearly proportional to that mass of water content. And I think I'm by far not the only person who is interested in VOD. There's an entire community out there of people who work on this. And so there's a lot of sort of papers that have been written with titles like this, right? loss of global terrestrial biomass, carbon losses, forests did not recover. What people are generally doing in the literature, if you see VOD, is they're looking at temporal variations in VOD and interpreting those as variations in biomass. And so you might say, hey, Alex, you just told me this is water content. In fact, the equation is on the same friggin' slide. What's going on here? And so that's sort of what people are doing there is it really comes from kind of a simple framework that I think is encapsulated nicely in this equation. We can take the mass of water above ground and just multiply and divide, algebraically by the total mass of everything above ground, right? The total above ground biomass. And when you see that, or when you do that rather, you see that the vegetation water content is sort of the product of the biomass and then a sort of relative water content, how much of the above ground mass, right, is water in that plant. And so if we then assume that the relative water content is constant, right, this just becomes some other constant of proportionality, and then ultimately your biomass and your VOD should be proportional. And in fact, actually, before I get to that, I should mention, right, that's a pretty strong assumption, at least from my point of view, as maybe you could tell by the fact that my introduction was all about water content. And so we really get some evidence about that from plant physiologists, right? And I already kind of mentioned this, the water content changes with leaf and xylem water potential inside a plant. And plant physiologists have known this for decades. In fact, they know it so well that they have a name for the curves that relate water content and water potential. It's called the PV curve. You see, some examples here for different species that folks have measured. And so you see that there's actually like a pretty strong one-to-one relationship here with the relative water content changing really, across the dynamic range, depending on conditions. So that sort of, maybe calls into question this assumption a little bit. And in fact, when we went at it, we said, okay, well, maybe this is just not a huge factor, right? Maybe this is something where I hand wave and say, hey, maybe the water stress should be significant, but if everyone else is using it for biomass, this is just falls away in the noise or something at scale. So we went out and we did a field campaign to test whether or not this water stress thing is significant and whether there's another signal here beyond the biomass. And so what we did is we just took the same sort of L-band radiometer that you see in some of our data sets in space, for example, and we stuck it on top of an old eddy covariance tower, had it look at a forest, this is out in Harvard Forest in central Massachusetts, so that we could go out and take water potential measurements by hand over this relatively small area and test if there was something here. And so perhaps the easiest way to help us figure out if there's a strong water potential signal that's not biomass is to look at diurnal variations, right? Biomass should not be changing dramatically over the course of the day. So if we look at sort of a typical diurnal cycle during this experiment here, we got our sort of manual measurements. We had a couple days where we went out really early and stayed out very late doing a full diurnal measurements of leaf water potential in the green. And you see that VOD, has a very similar sort of curvature to the leaf water potential, right? Really suggesting that this is something that we can pick up with remote sensing, even if that theoretical evidence from these curves is something that people do at the leaf scale. And in fact, we can go beyond this field campaign and look at global data, right? Say, okay, well, is this biomass relationship, is that just dominant at global scale? And maybe that's why everyone else looks at this for biomass data. And so we started out just doing, remaking a plot that is basically all over the literature. It turns out there's pretty good data about what the average biomass is across the world. And so if you just look at the time average VOD and the time average biomass, and you plot that, okay, this is seems like it's a pretty strong biomass signal here, right? But then if we start looking at the temporal variations, we worked with some folks at JPL to get sort of much more robust than we had previously, temporal biomass data set. And now we remove those spatial means and we just look at the temporal anomalies at different pixels. You see that almost all of the signal disappears. I mean, not quite all of it, but the majority, right? So I say this not just to like sling mud at people using this for biomass or anything. I mean, I think it's important that we don't use this data incorrectly, but I think it's also some pretty compelling evidence that there's some significant effect of water stress here, and therefore that there's an opportunity to use this data to understand how different ecosystems respond to changes in hydrometeorological conditions. So hopefully you agree with me on that, because I'm going to use it as the basis for the entire rest of the talk, and just kind of go through some of these examples here to give you a flavor for how we think this data can be useful. And the first topic I wanted to talk about was drought-driven tree mortality, which in recent years has been seemingly getting increasingly common, even though we don't really have the data for it, but some indirect evidence is shown in this map, where this is just a drought-driven tree mortality events where scientists happen to notice and go study it sort of in recent years. And so you can tell, there's a lot of these, right? And so with increasingly severe and frequent droughts and the climate change, we might want to know when that translates to significant sort of die-off rates. And those numbers can be significant, right? So, I live in California, where we get a perhaps somewhat California specific perspective on the news sometimes. And obviously the drought 2 droughts ago now was big news. So 2012, 2016, if we look at this, some of you might have heard some of these numbers from the Forest Service, 100 million. I think at some point they increased it to 150 million dead trees across the Sierra Nevada. Mortality rates in some of the heaviest years of up to 6 or 7% of the trees. Now, depending on your perspective, 6 or 7%, that may or may not sound like a lot. The way that I usually translate that is that that's basically 1 in 15 trees in any given year that are dying, right? So you have 15 years of this, like that's it for your entire forest. And it's obviously oversimplified and exaggerating. But the point is that these are, even if they may seem like small numbers, they are absolutely significant, especially when aggregated over a couple of years of drought. And the problem is drought-driven tree mortality continues to be this sort of really intractable problem. People just have a ton of a really hard time predicting it with anything that seems like it's above noise levels of accuracy, or above just flipping a coin or something. But when we started out doing this work, we heard about some folks in Montana that had done some pretty promising work with saplings in greenhouses, where they seem to find that at least for these saplings, the relative water content, exactly that thing that our VOD is sensitive to microwave remote sensing scales, that seemed to track the probability of mortality quite well. An R² of 0.9, totally unheard of in the mortality world in terms of how well it does. Now, of course, this is just a sapling, right? And so the question is, once you actually translate that to a complex environment like a forest, does that actually hold up? So we wanted to see if we could look at that with remote sensing. So we did, a little bit of just linear math. We calculated our own relative water content just by normalizing based on minimum and maximum values, or 5th and 95th percentiles over a long time series. We took advantage of the fact that VOD, the thing that we can sense with radiometers, is linearly proportional to vegetation water content. And that allows us to sort of translate the VOD that we see to a relative water content. And then we knew that this was too good to be true in a complex forest, and that we would never get such a simple relationship. But we also wanted to be able to study whether or not microwave remote sensing data could be useful without sort of relying on our ability to get, the most accurate model that would best take advantage of that. So instead, what we did is we just used sort of machine learning, right? A random forest, no pun intended, but we used a random forest method to try and see whether or not VOD was important or could be useful for predictions of mortality. And spoiler alert, I guess I should have phrased this differently, not to give a spoiler, but we show that it's pretty important, right? And so what that looks like, well, first of all, that only really works if we can actually have a good machine learning model in the first place, right? If your machine learning model is no good, then looking at how it attaches importance to different variables also is not very reliable. But we used some airborne person sitting on a plane, hand trying to figure out where the mortality is, data to help us build our model. And we did, by large scale mortality standards, what I think is a pretty good job. I mean, this was right up there. This work is a couple of years old now, but right up there basically with the state of the art in terms of mortality models and our ability to predict it. So we have some faith in this model now. And then when we go look at the parameter importance, we see that the relative water content from VOD is right up there. If you look at other models that try to predict mortality at scales, a lot of them use this climatic water deficit variable. You can see this is actually pretty far down and even works less well than just a static elevation field, right? So I think that this is sort of pretty promising sign of VOD being used for applications of vegetation drought response. But I promised three different examples. So I'll just give you two more to give you a sense. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what's known as live fuel moisture, sometimes live fuel moisture content in the context of wildfires. Again, a problem partially driven by my bias as a Californian, because I, like many others, do not always enjoy many weeks of bad air quality in the summer, but at least it's only quote unquote bad air quality. And in fact, it's not just my anecdotal evidence, right? If we look across the US as a whole, the Western US, across California, all of these, the number of acres burned in wildfires and many other wildfire related statistics have been going up by quite a bit. And in fact, what many other people have obviously studied this and have shown in about 1,000 different plots I could have chosen for this slide, that in any given year, how much area burns is actually quite closely related to the sort of hydrologic conditions, to the drought conditions, right? So this is a plot of just the total burn area across all Western US forests. And you see that this tracks quite well with sort of the average vapor pressure deficit or average atmospheric dryness in the region. So climate change seems to be a significant factor here. And I should mention, for the sake of completeness, this is a common point of confusion. It is far from the only factor, right? And I would get my head cut off by some people if I didn't make this clear. And I think it's an important part. There's other factors as well. Population growth in certain places, human ignition, fuels management that's been done in the Western US. Lots of overgrown fuels that burn much more aggressively, much more severely than they would otherwise. Those are all significant factors as well. But climate change is right up there with these other two, right? It's sort of all three important. But what does this mean? Like, what is driving this link is partially what we were interested in. How is atmospheric aridity actually translating to burn area of the stuff on the ground? And it sort of, stands to reason that perhaps one of the factors that also affects burned area is the flammability of those fuels, right? And that dry stuff is more flammable than wet stuff. So are the fuels dry enough when there's an ignition source? How easily does that happen? How fast does the fire propagate? All those things should depend on flammability. And when it comes to live vegetation, the way that fire experts generally pick their numbers is they look at this thing that I mentioned earlier, this live fuel moisture content, LFMC, which is just defined as the mass of water inside the plants normalized by the dry weight of the biomass of that plant. So mass of water in the plants hopefully starts to sound familiar, right? Again, perhaps something that we hope our microwave remote sensing might be helpful for here. And in fact, you know, this live fuel moisture content, I started out sort of in slide 3 or whatever number it was, saying, hey, water content should change with water potential, right? You see that here in the fire literature. It's sort of known that the live fuel moisture content as sort of a normalized water content varies with the water potential. That's going to change depending on the sort of hydrometeorology. And that was interesting to my group because, you know, the sort of LFMC or the water potential really, or both of these then, we thought might reflect not just, and other people, I should be clear, not just me, but other people have also shown, like you would then expect that there's a dependence not just on that hydrometeorology, right? When did it rain last? How dry has it been? But also on that response of the plants to that water stress. So, you know, when it rains, how deep is the rooting zone to be able to take up that water once it gets into the soil? What are the xylem and the stomatal properties like in terms of whether or not water that's taken up is held in the plants, keeping it wet versus it drying out? You know, there's sort of leaf structural traits that might affect a range of water content in this vegetation. All of these sort of different aspects of how plants respond to water stress in general that might influence, you know, that photosynthesis time series that I showed in the beginning, or their rate of mortality, et cetera, you know, in theory, in this very hand wavy way, might then also start affecting the live fuel moisture content, right? And it's not even just a plant, honestly. You know, I have this sort of slightly sad seeming plus topography, et cetera, right? But there's also a below ground part of all of this, right? How does your precipitation actually translate to sort of the distribution of water in the root zone? And so we sort of asked this question, like, okay, again, is this something that is just some hand wavy theory, but that might not ultimately matter when we get the large scale processes, right? Or not? Do these traits actually end up, if we know that they have an influence on fuel moisture, do they actually end up being a significant factor when it comes to overall ecosystem susceptibility to fire? So that was sort of our question we wanted to look at here. And, you know, this is not, I sort of accidentally, I think, made it seem that way just now, but it's not actually the world's most novel question. I think people have sort of had an intuition, if you talk to fire folks, that live fuel moisture content is important, but it's incredibly difficult and laborious to measure. And so it hasn't received much attention in the fire literature, I think just because there hasn't been any data. You know, the standard way of measuring live fuel moisture is to do kind of what's in these pictures. You go out, you trek somewhere, you take destructive clippings, you know, you weight them, you stick them in an oven for 24 hours to dry, you weight them again, right? Like doing that at scale is incredibly labor intensive. The US Forest Service impressively has this great data set. You see all these dots here where they collect measurements. That's something I really should have looked up the exact number. So don't quote me on it, but that's something like 85 or 90% of all of the publicly available live fuel moisture data in the world here in the Western US, right? Because it's just hard. Australia does a pretty good job too, but still like totally, you know, outshined by America. But so there's just not a whole lot of data, right? And again, I showed you in the beginning, lots of different drought responses from different plants that mean that if you have multiple species growing alongside each other, you know, and your manual clippings are from the wrong species, it might not even be that useful. So I will spare you the remote sensing and hope that you trust me on that for the sake of this talk. But off on the wrong side, we used synthetic aperture radar and these measurements and machine learning and a few other things to sort of map for the first time live fuel moisture content across the entire Western US, right? And you can see different locations here are evolving differently in time, depending on not just the meteorology, but also the plants that are there. So we now kind of, I think with remote sensing, have a data set that otherwise would have just been too difficult to collect, to go back and study this question that I just posed, right? Do these traits actually influence overall sort of fire ecosystem interactions? And just to be kind of really clear here, and because Krishna made a really great figure, kind of want to show this to you, right? So our hypothesis here is that we might say, okay, well, if you have a really drought sensitive ecosystem and you have high values of this thing called PWS, which I'll define in a second, the plant water sensitivity, if you're really highly sensitive as an ecosystem, you might expect that when you have high VPD, like in that first plot, the LFMC is going to drop. That ecosystem is just going to dry out and end up, you know, orange looking perhaps, although maybe not in real life, right? But in our figure here. Whereas, and by contrast, if you have an ecosystem that's much less sensitive to whatever atmospheric drying out might be happening, and that combination of the different soil and plant traits are keeping the water in there, you know, the LFMC should stay relatively wet, and you might imagine that it would be less flammable. So then now, if this is our hypothesis right now, this means that we must have some sort of quantitative metric for what a drought sensitive or a drought insensitive ecosystem might actually correspond to. And I'm, you know, packing a lot of sort of overview things into this talk. So, oh yeah, I forgot to show this, right? So then this is the second part of what we're promising here, or what we're, investigating here, not promising by any means because it's science. But what we're investigating here is that this, then if you have a greater drop in live fuel moisture, you might increase the risk of fire, right? Anyway, so we want to try and sort of figure out, are our ecosystems sensitive? Are different locations sensitive to drought or not? But again, there's lots of different drought response rates that I mentioned, all those challenges that I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, right? Different species responding differently. There's also a lot of interspecific variability, all still present. So we tried to just get this from the remote sensing, and we just sort of asked, you know, if you have a given climate anomaly in a given location, how does LFMC respond, right? You have a climate anomaly here. Do you have an LFMC that's relatively constant even when there's that climate anomaly? Or do you, you know, change more significantly depending on what the meteorological conditions are? So we use an autocorrelative model to sort of quantify that. I won't go into the details of the math. But basically what you end up with when you sort of try to answer this question quantitatively is you get a map that looks something like this. Highly heterogeneous map of what we're calling the integrated plant water sensitivity. That's sort of combining all of those different factors that I mentioned before. If you know what the Western US looks like, which I realize is not quite everyone in this room, maybe depending on your field more or less interesting, but this doesn't look like any particular pattern in the Western US in any clear way, at least not to my eyes or anyone else's eyes that I've shown this map to. If it looks like something to you, I would love to hear it. I mean, we've actually been able to explain away, if we combine multiple different integrating factors, I think about 75% of this map, right? So I'm sort of okay with this map not looking like anything because it's supposed to represent lots of different drought response traits. And those drought response traits are variable because plants, you know, try and do everything they can to find a niche in which they can survive, right? You know, we sort of trust that our data is reasonable here, and hopefully you do too. But now that we have this, what we can do is we can say, okay, well, different places, even if they're in totally different locations that have similar sort of degrees to which that ecosystem is sensitive to drought, we can ask, do those different locations behave similarly when it comes to fire, right? Do we actually see systematically that these places with high sensitivity are more susceptible to fire? And the nice part about this plot not looking like anything else is that then it's a lot easier for us to be confident that we don't just have some sort of cross-correlative analysis that is really reflecting some other mechanism. And so, that's exactly kind of the calculation that we did here, where we sort of grouped these different pixels of different plant water sensitivity across the Western US, and then compared the burned area behavior in these different sort of combinations of pixels across disparate locations. And you see that there's a pretty strong connection between that. So all of this sort of local hand-wavy, things that we might typically think about at the plant scale as plant traits, it turns out even over the scales of the Western US has an effect on wildfire behavior. And that's significant because wildfire models conventionally don't really account for any of this at all. If there's a live fuel moisture that's different from the atmosphere in there at all, like the best it will do is it will say, hey, this is going to depend upon whether you're in a grassland or a forest. Beyond sort of these very vague, maybe what type of plant functional type level distinctions you have, this is not really accounted for in wildfire models right now. So we're sort of excited, and I think I put this in this talk about microwave remote sensing because I think it sort of illustrates, what we can do with live fuel moisture content that would have just been too labor intensive to be able to get enough data to say this at fire scales otherwise. Maybe I'll use this to stave off the cough and have a bit more water. And people should feel free to interrupt their questions as we go along instead of just at the end, by the way, but I realize we're already 2/3 of the way through. All right, so maybe one more quick example before we run out of time here. I wanted to talk a little bit also about what to do about traits, right? It's easy for me to say, hey, you have this variability from ecosystem to ecosystem, right? Across the different locations in this map. Wildfire models should take all of this variability into account. Well, how do you actually go about doing that? Is easier said than done. How do we actually figure out, given that we know that there's too many species to go out and measure that everywhere, what the sort of variability in the drought response traits should be? Well, again, this is where I think microwave remote sensing can come in handy. I guess I just accidentally gave my introduction here, right? But the sort of question was like, okay, well, we know that large-scale models can account for this variability. Can we get any sort of information about, regional to global scale variability in these traits that looks different from just having to rely on knowing the species that are there? So, so we asked the question here, can we calculate sort of the effective drought response traits of diverse sort of canopies in different ecosystems to see how they might respond to water stress? So these are the things that I mentioned a couple slides ago, but it's things like the P50, if that means anything to you, right? The level of xylem water potential at which the xylem conductance drops by half. It might be some parameters related to how quickly stomata close if there's water stress. We wanted to see if we can sort of figure out how that actually varies across the world. So the way we did that, is we used a model data fusion sort of approach. Actually, originally, partially, this was not quite the work that we did with Shui, but originally partially developed in collaboration with Shui. And so in sort of a similar principle here, where we just basically ran a hydrologic model for a ton of different potential hydraulic traits, right? Simulated the evapotranspiration and the vegetation water content, and thus the VOD that might come under those different traits, looked at observations from remote sensing, and then just used a Markov chain Monte Carlo approach to try and get those optimal parameters. And I'll spare you the details, but when we do that, we get a bunch of maps of traits across the world that look like this. So this, for those of you familiar with the Medlin model, this is the G1 parameter. So this is basically a measure of sort of inverse water use efficiency. So the more red colors here are going to be places where you're less water use efficient as an ecosystem. So you sort of lose relatively more water for each unit of carbon that you gain. And so this map, again, doesn't look like a map of just biomes across the world, because we know that there's variability within that. Quite difficult to validate sort of explicitly because we just don't have good data. But if we look at the patterns here in sort of the remaining last couple of minutes, we can find some patterns here that help us feel reasonably good about this data, right? So there's no information in this process at all that the model has about whether or not you have grasses or what kind of land cover are. But we see that grasses systematically have higher G1, which is consistent with sort of theoretical and experimental values. We know, consistent with ground measures, that boreal values here we see show up in our model as relatively low. So we get some confidence. It's okay, well, this is still a little bit model dependent. So we want to see, can we still get something from this map that is different than what all models do right now, which is what I sort of hand waved earlier, right? Plant functional types. How is a grass different from a forest, which might look like a map like this, which you can tell looks pretty different. And so we wanted to sort of be fair and say, okay, can we define alternative functional types? Plant functional types is only like 15 different values that those models need to optimize. That's a lot easier, right, than having it figure out one different value for every pixel. Can we come up with maybe just an alternative that is more data driven, a small number? We have 6 different what we call hydraulic functional types here that we could use instead, that just come from grouping our map from before for different parameters. And when we do that, we in fact see that across much of the world, this sort of leads to significant improvements in the relative error of our ET simulations. So these traits that we can get from remote sensing might also help us, even if you're not looking at something as extreme as drought or fire in simulating ET. So with that, I think I'm basically already over time. So I'm just gonna throw up some general conclusion slides here. But I wanted to sort of give you a bit of an introduction to these data, which I think are personally pretty promising, and give you an idea of how we could use them for fluxes, like in the last slide, but also for things like mortality or fire, and in my biased view, many more applications. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Any questions for Alex? Shui, you might have some questions. Okay.
I was wondering, just thinking along the line of more extended applications, right? Like at the beginning, you talked about this applied at global scale, but then you also mounted a sensor over like a EC tower.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how much of this particular novel approach depends on the theory behind how you post-process the signals versus the physical constraint around the instruments. And the specific application that I'm thinking of is that if you wanted even more highly resolved data, is it possible to mount it on a drone, for example?
Yeah. Okay, that's a great question. Well, that's a great 3 questions in one. But so yeah, so I totally scooped over it, right? I had my hand wavy, careful, maybe it's not worth going back to, but I had this sort of slide that said, hey, this is not a trivial process, right? And Archie and I were actually just talking about that this morning. You know this better than anyone, but the problem with studying leaf water potential is that there's not nearly as much leaf water potential data out there as I think you and I would like. And I'm sure, pick your variable for anyone in this room that you study, that's true for any given data set. But I think in general, leaf water potential in particular has been really hard to measure, right? Because it's destructive. You got to carry compressed gas around. It's expensive. And so we've been struggling a lot, relative to like soil moisture, for example. The other thing that these same measurements are sensitive to, there's so much more soil moisture data. And so just explicit validation of our data sets in like the, best way you would possibly do, which is just compare it to something on the ground that you really trust, has been really hard because we have these relatively coarse resolution, 10 or 25 kilometer, depending on the data set data. And like, we just don't have enough on the ground measurements to be able to compare that at scale. And so we've tried to sort of, in the proof is in the pudding, right? Kind of like I tried to do today, but also at lower levels, try to find enough evidence that I'm not just totally stringing together hand wavy arguments that don't end up holding up. But all of that is a super long-winded way of saying that we basically can't really answer your question because we haven't, other than this one field campaign, that we did, whatever, I'm not going to find it, doesn't matter, but that you were alluding to with the diurnal cycle, like that's sort of the one field campaign that we had. And that particular sensor we used there, we were collaborating with some others. It kept breaking all the time. And like the company, at one point, the company they themselves didn't have any more radiometers at this particular startup because their last working model they gave to us. This stuff like gets messy. And I think part of the reason maybe I talked so much about why microwaves are great for this problem comes from the fact that, partially from the fact that like, yeah, it's a little different from standard optical remote sensing that most people have seen, but also because it is, it's coarse resolution, it's expensive. Like it's if you wanted to put something on a drone, it's a lot easier to just put a camera on a drone or put, some 3 or 4 band, multispectral sensor on a drone. So to get to your other question, like you could put microwaves on a drone, but it would probably be expensive. And I think I actually wrote a proposal for it at some point with a buddy of mine who's like a radar jockey. And we had trouble finding, given the weight, drones that would be able to stay up for a while. So we proposed to look at blimps, right? That didn't get funded. But so, it's kind of a little bit of a challenging problem. I think there's now this thing called software defined radar that like 5-10 years on the horizon maybe will solve this. But all of which is a long-winded way to answer your many questions is like, yes, there's a lot of radiative transfer details here that we don't have the data to test. That, if we had that data, folks like Ardisher's group or there's various of us, I think that we could easily do, I think, plenty of things, and there's plenty of reasons to think that we could get the algorithms just right. But we can't do that yet. And then it is a little bit expensive if you want to do all kinds of other stuff with it when you don't already have NASA to launch a big expensive satellite for you. But in my, again, totally biased view, like I think there's just so much here that we can't get with NDVI or whatever that it's worth it.
Yeah, I'm interested in learning more, but we should maybe chat afterwards. So.
Yeah, that was already a long answer. So.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was interesting. I'm just curious about in 2 of your examples. For instance, first example, you used L-band VOD, and the last example, you used X-band VOD. So my assumption is that you used X-band for the last example because you want to extract more information about the traits of the plant. So I think at higher frequency, VOD will be more sensitive to the structure of the plant and leaf water content compared to L-band VOD, which will be more sensitive to the stem water content. So first question is that there are many VOD products available right now at different frequencies. So do you think that integration of those VOD products can give more useful information that at least, single individual product will not be able to give that? Yeah.
Yeah, great question. I think the short answer is yes. I will say, for completeness sake, we used X-band in that last example just because we wanted to have a long record. and I don't really trust the SMOS VOD, and the L-band, the SMAP record was sort of too short. But you know, all of that having been said, like all of these inferences that you made are 100% correct. You know, the higher frequencies you would expect to be more sensitive to perhaps the canopy and the less woody components of the canopy, and you know, that sort of helps you get a cleaner leaf signal. That having been said, I think this kind of comes back to Shui's question. Like, I would love it if we had better validation data to really look into that. And if we could get to a point where we could get, supported by enough validation data, enough radiative transfer complexity, right? Multi-layer, there's nothing stopping us from building a multi-layer radiative transfer model where you might say, hey, I'm going to treat my leaves and my stem a little differently. And you know, the sort of ecohydrologists in the room are nodding, because you would expect the stem and the leaves to have a slightly different signal. And I totally like hand waved over that and ignored that sort of complexity. And so I think that, like, pipe dream, I should actually, maybe I'll use this to sort of advertise. You know, we actually had, just to show that this is not just me, we ran a workshop at Caltech in person. This is right before the pandemic in 2019, to sort of basically about this topic that I've talked about today, applied to forest. So, you know, 30 people, a bunch of these are you know, plant physiologists and hydrologists, et cetera. And one of the real sort of pipe dreams that came out is like, hey, can we actually combine the multi-frequency model, the multi-frequency observations, right? And start to separate out what's happening in the different layers of the canopy. So I think you were sort of, you know, alluding to all of that. In the meantime, you know, we make hand wavy statements about how L-band is, you know, more sensitive to woody components, but we don't understand it nearly as well as I would like, because we don't quite have the validation data yet.
It is on. Okay. I think there is a delay. So I just have one more quick question. So you mentioned that VODs, am I reading you right or not? You mentioned that VOD is not directly related to biomass sometimes. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Because I've seen a lot of Nature paper that people studied changes of VOD and then said, oh, VOD is going down, so we are losing biomass. Or for different vegetation types, VOD has a different kind of correlation with NDVI, or the greenness of the top of the canopy. So now you are arguing that VOD might not be always correlated to vegetation biomass. Is that right?
That is what I'm, and it comes back to this equation, right? So we know maybe these two equations. So we know VOD, you know, we can trust VOD is sort of proportional to vegetation water content. We know that vegetation water content, in the absence of changes to the relative water content, is proportional to biomass. But because we sort of see that there's this relative water content effect as well, that big if that I just said, in the absence of changes to relative water content, you know, doesn't seem to be true at scale, and we wouldn't necessarily expect it to be true at scale. And in fact, here we see, you know, when we actually look at the temporal anomalies and see, which is exactly what folks in the literature do, you know, there doesn't seem to be much of a signal here. Now, you know, we're not having, we should go back to like the academic duel days, right? This is my biased view on this. We could talk for a long time about, and I think some of the groups using that data have tried to not just use mean annual VOD and try to sort of account for this a tiny little bit, and this biomass data set has noise, and like there's a ton of caveats here, and I like left off the names of the authors of those papers on purpose because I don't want to like disparage anyone, right? But I think it's important that we, you know, that you're a little bit careful with those data sets. But it just shows, I think the flip side is it shows the sort of desperate need for more remote sensing data of stuff other than greenness. So I can't really blame anyone in that respect. Yeah.
One more.
I noticed that topography came up a couple of times in your talk, and then you were like, okay, let's not worry about that. And so then I was like, oh, maybe we can go back to using soil moisture content as like a hand wavy correlation to topography. Do you see any correlations between like your planned water sensitivity or other things?
Oh,
with
and
those
mean
kinds
soil
of-
moisture?
With
That's
soil
a great question. We haven't looked at that, in part because of two main reasons I would be a little bit worried about that. One is that so the surface soil, the soil moisture that we get from remote sensing, dirty secrets of remote sensing, microwave remote sensing, it's really only the very top surface values, top couple centimeters, right? And so how representative of that is a little hard to say sometimes by itself. The other reason I would be a little bit worried about that is just because of this issue of like that I hand waved over, we're doing a retrieval first, and by we I mean me, but also lots of other people, of separating out the soil moisture and the vegetation water content signal from the same observations. If there's any sort of imperfection in that, and your like VOD signal partially leaks into the soil moisture or vice versa, you would get like an artificially high correlation. So that makes that maybe a little bit tough, but conceptually it's a really interesting idea, and I might have to I'll think about it a bit more because that could be useful.
Any additional questions? So thank you so much, Alex, for the wonderful talk. So give her another round of applause. Thank you so much for taking the time.